This is the 1831 Wolf's Mill, or Wolf Creek Mill, or Pine Run Mill. Has a few different names. Let's go take a look inside, and we'll talk about why it has those names and what we're doing with it here today.
Of course, the first thing you notice before we even go in is the giant 16-foot, 5-meter diameter water wheel. This wheel was fed in a fairly unique way, so let's actually go take a look at it before we go inside. When this mill was built in 1831, Isaac Wolf didn't actually have a good water supply. Instead, he channeled water from 9 different springs through ditches and wooden sluices to a small reservoir, which then supplied this water wheel. You might notice a few tiny leaks, or, well, maybe half the water, never actually makes it over the wheel. As they aged, leaks just got worse and worse. But as long as you had enough water to run the mill, why worry about it, right? Let's go inside now and see what this water wheel is actually doing. We're about 3 miles, 5 kilometers south of Loudonville, Ohio, inside Mohican State Park. But the mill was actually built originally about 6 miles, 10 kilometers north of here. It was built near, but not on, what's now known as Wolf's Creek. Since Wolf Creek didn't have enough drop on the property to power a mill, pulling water from those 9 springs to run the water wheel still allowed Isaac Wolf to power this mill. If we peek out this window, we can actually see the water wheel turning, and we can see it shares a shaft with this large pit wheel. That wheel sits down in a pit below the floor level here, which is where the giant gear gets its name. The pit wheel turns the same speed as the water wheel, so it has a massive amount of torque. You may notice the pit wheel, as well as some of the parts out on the water wheel, are made of metal. That's because this area floods regularly, including inside the pit, and wood tends to rot. You typically need to replace a water wheel about every 20 to 30 years in regular use, but by using these metal parts, which were of course a later addition, things actually last quite a bit longer here now. The pit wheel turns the same speed as the water wheel, so it has a massive amount of torque on it, but not nearly enough speed to do any work for us here. That's why it goes through this small horizontal gear called the wallower. The wallower turns much faster than the original, far larger pit wheel, and it also shares an axle with the larger great spur wheel above. You can see how much faster the horizontal great spur wheel is turning compared with the vertical pit wheel, which remember is turning the same speed as the water wheel. And here you can see the small gear, called the stone nut, suspended above the great spur wheel. The stone nut is lifted up now, preventing the millstones from turning. It could be dropped down when the wheel stopped, of course, to engage the millstone. Mills would often only want to run 1 stone at a time. This could be the case if they had only 1 miller working, for example, or if they didn't have very much water at the time, or maybe if they were working on one of the stones. So these stone nuts allow them to engage only 1 wheel or the other wheel, or in fact they could have neither wheel at all running if they wanted. Of course, most of the work was actually done upstairs. You see that huge turning vertical shaft? That's the same vertical shaft we saw downstairs. Each floor would also have another gear connecting that shaft to a large overhead line drive system running across the floor, powering everything in the mill. The star of any mill, of course, are the millstones. Here at Wolf's Mill, they ran a pair of imported French burr stones. This especially hard quartz was mined in France and shipped in rough blocks as ship's ballast to the east coast of the U.S. Once it arrived, it was cut and assembled into millstones, with a single millstone being made up of as many as a few dozen smaller blocks, all bound together with an iron band. Here you can see a smaller version of what that looks like, and how the millstones are dressed to allow them to grind grain effectively. Check out my video on millstones for more information about them. It's linked in the description. You can't actually see them here, but there's two stones inside this wooden cabinet. The bottom stone, called the bed stone, is set level with the floor here, and it doesn't move. The top stone, called the runner, sits atop a metal rod called a damsel. Your goal as a miller is that the runner floats just barely above the bed stone as it spins. You adjust the spacing between the stones using this handle, called a tentering wheel. It connects through a multi-part lever system to let you make minute adjustments up and down on the runner stone. Once the grain is ground, it's still not quite ready for use though. The flour drops down a chute, and then, after going through a series of chutes and belt conveyors called elevators, would be dropped into one end of these flour dressers. I'll be making another video on how these chute and elevator systems worked in another video later on. Flour dressers, which are still used in modern flour mills today, ensure the flour is properly ground. They drop the flour into one end of a rotating drum, and the properly ground flour falls through the fine screen into the bin below and is sent for packaging. Anything too big falls out the end and is either sent back to the stones to be reground, discarded, or maybe fed to farm animals. You see there's several here. There's actually a good reason for that. Different flours need different sizes. So you can either change out the rotating drums every time you need to change to a different flour, or just have different flour dressers for the different flour types. If you're grinding hard winter wheat, for example, which is great for bread, you want a consistent, fairly fine flour. If you're grinding corn, on the other hand, you'll likely want several different sizes. You want larger pieces for grits or polenta, smaller pieces for cornmeal, and you want it really finely ground for corn flour, just like the wheat flour. For that, you'd actually have a flour dresser with several different screens of different sizes on the drum, starting with the most fine and getting more coarse as you head down the drum, with each different type going into a separate bin. Of course, before you can even start grinding the grain, you have to get it up here and clean it.
Hey, just want to take a second to real quickly thank all of my members here, both on YouTube and on Patreon at patreon.com/industrialrevolution. My members make it possible for me to come out and film stuff like this. If you want to join in, you get special benefits. Check out the link here. Let's get back to the video.
This crane, called a friction drive sack hoist, was manually operated. You'd use a lever to move that big wooden wheel up against another large wheel, which was running off the same overhead line drive system that powers everything else. It'd be used to lift up the 50-pound bags of grain, typically a couple at a time. Once the grain is up here, you'd run them through different cleaning machines like these. There are plenty of different types made by different companies over the years. Some shake the grain across screens to knock everything loose. Others spin it through drums. And still others blow high-speed air through and across the grain to blow off the chaff, the dirt, and other contaminants. Mills will often use a combination of these machines, depending on the grain. Names you may have heard for this include fanning mills, think of the ones with the blowers, or smutters, which aren't what you think. There's a specific wheat fungus called smut that you have to remove from the wheat before you grind it, and that's what the smutter did. Unfortunately, while they have these machines here at Wolf's Mill, they don't actually have any of it hooked up to run, and probably none of it has actually run since about March 23rd, 1913. Coming into late March 1913, heavy snow covered the frozen ground across Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Then the rain started. Over the next few days, between 6 and 11 inches, 15 to 28 centimeters, of rain fell across the entire region, melting the snow. With the ground still frozen solid, all that water had nowhere to go. The flooding covered the entire region. This photo from Columbus, Ohio, a little over an hour southwest of here, was pretty typical. Everywhere was underwater. The canals throughout the region were washed out and never reopened. Rail lines fared a bit better and did eventually recover. Before the Great Flood of 1913, there were well over 1,000 grist mills operating in Ohio. By 1922, only 94 had managed to reopen. Wolf's Mill wasn't among them. In 1925, an attempt was made to reopen the site as a resort, serving chicken dinners on weekends, but the Great Depression, just a few years later, ensured that didn't work out. In 1931, a traveler said of Wolf's Mill that it was in a state of collapse. The Waterwheel itself leans over against the mill, no more to make a turn, till the crack of doom. And that's how it sat until 1972, when, slated for demolition for an expansion of State Route 60, Ed Pennell purchased the mill, disassembled it, moved it, and reassembled it, piece by piece, at the current location on Pine Run. It was reopened in 1975 as a combination mill, tourist attraction, and ice cream parlor, but it only lasted until the mid-1980s, when it closed again. In 1990, the state of Ohio purchased the mill, intending to use it as office space for the adjacent Mohican State Park. Fortunately, budget cuts, which have done so much damage to historic resources everywhere, actually ended up saving Wolf's Mill, since there was no money to convert it to office space. Instead, they just left it abandoned. In 1998, the Friends of Wolf Creek Pine Run Grist Mill was formed to restore the mill. With the state having abandoned their plans to make it into office space, this group was able to bring it back to what you see here today.
So the Wolf's Mill or Wolf Creek Mill or Pine Run Mill is no longer operating today. They are still open to the public. As you can see, the water wheel is still turning, a lot of the inside machinery is still running. And I've got a great set of volunteers here to answer any questions, show you around, tell you how the place used to work. And that's why mills like this is the Industrial Revolution. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd help out the channel, like, share, subscribe, and comment. I love reading the comments. I usually respond to them pretty quick. Also, if you want to see some more of my mill videos, I have a playlist over here full of mill videos, or the one up here that YouTube thinks you'd really enjoy watching next. Again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.